Introduction. Dangers lurk in all systems. Systems incorporate the unexamined beliefs of their creators. Adopt a system, accept its beliefs, and you help strengthen the resistance to change. Frank Herbert, God Emperor of Dune. In the spring of 2018, Northwestern Medicine opened its new hospital campus in the leafy Chicago suburb of Lake Forest. The $400 million complex is the latest addition to Northwestern Memorial Healthcare's impressive system. The sprawling main campus, which sits immediately east of luxury shopping on Chicago's famed Michigan Avenue, includes the recently constructed $280 million Prentice Women's Hospital and $600 million Lurie Children's Hospital. The nearby flagship Northwestern Memorial Hospital has undergone more than $1 billion in expansions and renovations. Northwestern's 4,000 physicians, including 1,500 who are employed by the system, practice at more than 200 facilities throughout Chicagoland, delivering the whole gamut of patient services, from basic primary care to the most technologically advanced diagnostic and surgical procedures. Northwestern also seems to have converted any number of defunct borders, office depots, and linens and things into freestanding medical office buildings. This enormous medical care provider is also a big business. Northwestern is Chicago's 16th largest employer and, with annual revenues of around $5 billion, it brings in as much money as many well-known global businesses, such as Goldman Sachs and Tiffany, and about the same as Fox News, CNN, and MSNBC combined. One Northwestern is not even the largest health system in the Chicago metro area. That honor belongs to Advocate Health, whose annual revenues exceed $6 billion. North Shore University Health, the University of Chicago, and Loyola Medicine are not that far behind. As big as they currently are, they continuously plow their revenues into further growth, spreading their tentacles further and further across the Chicago metropolitan area. Table I.1. The nation's largest mega providers, as of 2017. System. Location. Revenue. Comparable. UPMC. Western Pennsylvania. $16 billion. Whole Foods. Chicago is far from unique. Nearly every metropolitan area has its own giant healthcare systems. We call them mega providers. Table I.1 gives annual revenues for some of the top local mega providers, and identifies national and global companies in other industries that have similar revenues. Baylor, Scott, and White, which dominates the Dallas healthcare landscape, does as much business as Chipotle worldwide. Northwell, which dominates Long Island, is as big as Adobe Systems. The University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, which has a near stranglehold on Pittsburgh and much of the rest of western Pennsylvania, is as big as Whole Foods. These mega providers are so large because the overall healthcare industry is enormous. With total U.S. healthcare spending approaching $4 trillion, equivalent to roughly 18% of gross domestic product, even a locally based healthcare organization can be as big as giants in other industries. These are just the tip of the iceberg. Other mega providers include Fairview Health Services, 11 hospitals in the Twin Cities, Emory Healthcare, 10 hospitals in the Atlanta metro area, BJC Healthcare, 9 hospitals in and around St. Louis, and Jefferson Einstein, 18 hospitals in the Philadelphia area. Point 2. Some systems span several local markets, with dominant positions in some places if not everywhere. Adventist Providence St. Joseph operates 9 hospitals across Northern California. ProMedica has 13 hospitals in Ohio and Michigan. Greenville Palmetto owns 13 hospitals across South Carolina. Wellmount Mountain States operates 21 hospitals in Tennessee and Virginia, and Atrium Health runs 48 hospitals in the Carolinas and Georgia. All mega provider systems own several hospitals, employ or ally with thousands of physicians, and have countless freestanding outpatient facilities and long-term care beds. A few offer their own health insurance products. 3. With mega-sized revenues comes mega-sized executive compensation. In 2017, at least 50 executives at nonprofit systems earned more than $4 million. At the top end, 7 executives earned more than $8 million, with Innova's CEO bringing home $14 million, topped only by the $16 million that Kaiser paid to its CEO. These figures may seem excessive, but they are in line with how other big businesses pay their executives. If we equate size with success, then health system CEOs have earned every penny. If we instead demand that our CEOs contain costs, then some would be lucky to make the minimum wage. Teflon-coated providers. As health spending spirals out of control, putting healthcare beyond the reach of many Americans and eating into the savings of many more, it is no wonder that a large majority of Americans believe that the U.S. healthcare system is broken. 5 According to a recent Levitt survey, 70% of respondents believe that the system requires fundamental changes or even a complete rebuild. 6 Most Americans blame insurers, drug makers, and the government for the current predicament, and it is no surprise that drug makers compete with health insurers for most frequently being described as rapacious. 7 Very few Americans, no more than 5% in the Levitt survey, blame hospitals or doctors. Likewise, politicians are quick to blame insurers and drug makers. Some prominent Democrats refuse to accept contributions from them, but they rarely blame hospitals and physicians, and eagerly accept their big-dollar contributions. The blame is misplaced. Neither insurers nor the government order tests, write prescriptions, or perform surgeries. While many drugs are expensive to the point of seeming exorbitant, prescription drug spending accounts for less than 11% of total health spending. 8 You could eliminate all administrative costs, wipe out insurance and drug industry profits, and slash their executives' salaries, and healthcare would still be incredibly expensive. As much as we complain about insurers, drug companies, and government bureaucrats, it is our healthcare providers who are largely responsible for the cost and quality of care. About 52% of every dollar spent on healthcare goes directly to hospitals and doctors. Even this understates their importance. Doctors make decisions that affect roughly 80 to 85% of every dollar spent. 9 The most expensive medical technology is not drugs or magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, it is the physician's pen. 10. Mega providers like those listed in Table I.1 assume the biggest responsibility for the state of our health system. They generate the lion's share of expenses, and their executives are handsomely rewarded. Yet Americans are unwilling to take them to task. This might be understandable if mega providers were slowing the pace of spending growth, but the facts that we will lay out suggest just the opposite. A recently published study by Zach Cooper and colleagues offers one compelling piece of evidence. Point 11. The title of the paper hints at the findings. The price ain't right. Hospital prices and health spending on the privately insured. Cooper et al. Explain why health spending varies so much from one place to another, even after controlling for local differences in the medical needs of patients. They find that fully half of the variation stems from variation in provider prices. Point 12. Prices are higher where hospitals have more market power, and prices increase when hospitals merge, especially when those hospitals are nearby and are likely to have been close competitors. This latter finding bears on an important theme of this book. Healthcare is local, and mega providers have a great deal of power in their local markets. The price ain't right is just one of many studies documenting how mega providers accumulate market power and use that power to drive up prices without creating offsetting efficiencies. Other studies find no improvements in patient outcomes. If anything, mega providers contribute to lower quality care. This means that wherever mega providers dominate local markets, healthcare spending is higher, often much higher, and healthcare quality is no better, and sometimes lower. This is a big win for mega providers, and a big loss for everyone else. If this is not bad enough, rather than engaging physicians in the process of reforming healthcare, mega providers have caused them to become increasingly disaffected, disgruntled, and distrusting, making it harder to effect meaningful improvements in costs and outcomes. While the executives who put the mega providers together may not have intended to cause such damage, they have failed to turn their size to our advantage. It is time that we recognize the mega providers for the mega problems they are. If they are so successful, how can they be so bad? Many economists, including Nobel Prize winners Kenneth Arrow and George Stigler, have offered a quasi-Darwinian view of markets. Firms dominate their industries by offering superior value to consumers. Point 13. Some, like Walmart and Amazon, might have lower costs. Others, like Microsoft and Facebook, offer products and services that consumers covet. Whatever the means for value creation, the firms that create the most value survive and grow. Big firms are not perfect. Of course, no organization is, but their strengths more than offset their weaknesses. In other words, we should not make knee-jerk objections to large, financially successful firms, because most big firms got that way by building better mousetraps. This view rests on two big assumptions. The first is that all organizations face the cauldron of competition from current rivals and future entrants. The second is that at least some firms know how to create value for their customers. When both of these are true, competition can work its magic. Those organizations that best create value will usually outcompete their rivals, and a few may even dominate their markets. Thus, firms like Hyundai and Boeing are big because they know how to meet the needs of their customers. Hyundai makes really good small cars and, for the most part, Boeing makes the best large airframes for commercial air travel, although the 737 MAX debacle shows how even the mighty can fall. There is nothing wrong when firms grow large because they deliver more value than their rivals. 14. After a combined 7 decades of research, we have a difficult time embracing the quasi-Darwinian view in healthcare markets. As things now stand, too many mega providers face too little competition, and too many of their executives seemingly do not know how to manage the complex process of organizing and delivering healthcare. What is especially troubling is that the two problems are intertwined. As we will detail, mega providers came together out of the misguided belief that integration would generate scale economies and other efficiencies. It hasn't happened. Instead, mega providers have concentrated healthcare markets and have avoided the pitfalls of competition. Instead of effective managers facing the cauldron of competition, we have ineffective managers avoiding competition. So much for Darwin. While many forces have indeed transformed the U.S. healthcare system over the past century, they have not meaningfully transformed large hospitals. Point 15. The organization, lines of authority, and workflows of the modern hospital are not all that much different from what they were decades ago, and the same inefficiencies persist. Hospitals have instead transformed their financial relationships with each other, and with other stakeholders. By merging to become mega providers, hospitals have learned how to exercise local market power, charge higher prices, and exclude competitors. Some health insurers, especially Blue Cross Blue Shield, have accumulated power of their own, leaving the two sides battling over the division of the healthcare pie rather than diligently working to reduce the size of the pie. While the antitrust agencies do what they can to limit the accumulation of market power, and have enjoyed some notable recent successes, they are limited by a combination of factors that we will discuss. Competition policy alone will not rescue our healthcare system, and if it is poorly implemented, it will do more harm than good. We believe that most healthcare executives sincerely want to reduce costs and improve quality. Unfortunately, many of them remain convinced that scale and scope are the answer. At the same time, even the most sincere executives cannot resist exploiting market power, bringing in more revenue, and investing in further growth. Like the cat chasing its tail, they may never realize the efficiencies and higher quality they seek, for the simple reason that size is no guarantee of performance. The result is higher health spending without commensurate higher quality. Is it any wonder that the American healthcare system is ailing? Things are so bad that everyone seems to be seeking a cure, not just politicians. Corporate bigwigs like Warren Buffett, Jeff Bezos, and Jamie Dimon are trying to fix the healthcare system through innovative business practices drawn from outside healthcare. No matter how you look at the present situation, mega providers, which have relied far too long on market power rather than effective performance, seem ripe for disruption. Given that the promise of disruption in healthcare served up by Clay Christensen 2 decades ago has yet to materialize, we question whether the answers will come from the outside. Point 16. The healthcare industry must heal itself. As with any illness, finding the right cure requires an accurate diagnosis. The first step is taking a medical history, which can provide many clues about the disease. The ills of the American healthcare system have been incubating for a long time, so our history begins a century ago. We will examine how healthcare providers brought us miracles of modern medicine, but also fought to defend their turf. Exercising political influence while wielding market power, sometimes illegally, the medical establishment kept at bay outsiders who had new ideas for reducing costs and improving access, ideas that would have eroded the power of organized medicine. Hospitals worked especially hard to retain their dominance of local markets, and as hospitals grew bigger and more powerful, healthcare spending began a long ascent that shows no sign of abating. The illness metastasized in the 1990s, when hospitals sought further protection by creating integrated delivery systems. These systems combined academic medical centers and community hospitals with physician groups, outpatient care centers, and health insurance offerings. Thus began the takeover of healthcare delivery in entire metropolitan areas. As a strategy for reducing health spending, integration was a complete failure. Much of the blame fell squarely on healthcare executives, who bought into the ideas of scale and scope economies without any evidence that these economies existed, and without any notion of how to make the organizational whole greater than the sum of its member parts. This was made most apparent by examining the fate of physicians, who gave up their private practices to become hospital employees, turning what was a professional calling into an unsatisfying job. Integration may not have served the interests of healthcare consumers or physicians, but there was a silver lining for the systems, which used their newfound market clout to fight off the cost containment efforts of employer-sponsored insurance plans. In the second part of this book, we examine the current state of American healthcare. Emboldened by ineffective antitrust enforcement, integrated systems continued to grow, becoming today's mega providers. The takeover was complete. Despite their lofty compensation, healthcare executives have not figured out how to make systems work for patients or physicians. They have figured out how to wield their ever-increasing market power. In the third part, we offer our diagnosis and recommend treatment. The diagnosis: mega providers need better management, but remain dominant by exercising market power. The treatment: combining our experiences in the fields of economics and sociology, we will offer guidance to managers on how to create value in complex healthcare organizations. We will also offer ideas for reforming competition policy, so that all participants in healthcare markets, from solo practitioners to mega providers, including newcomers like Buffett et al., have a fair opportunity to prove themselves in the cauldron of competition. Time will tell whether mega providers emerge from the cauldron in better shape than when they went in. We suspect not. The elephant in the room. As we write this book, Americans are engaged in a strenuous debate about whether to replace our market-based health system with top-down control. We will not wade into the policy debate about the relative merits of Medicare for all, repeal and replace, or something in between. Nor will we presume that we know with any certainty whether our current market-based health system will remain largely intact. Although Democrats prevailed in the 2020 election, that may not spell the end of private health insurance, and it will almost certainly leave mega providers intact. Private health insurers currently play a large role in Medicare and Medicaid. More than one-third of Medicare beneficiaries, and most patients on Medicaid, have private health insurance that operates under government rules. If private health insurance survives a government takeover, the ongoing battle for market power between insurers and providers will continue unabated. If there is no private insurance option, Medicare may still promote integration. Consider that the most significant catalysts in the recent growth of mega providers' accountable care organizations are a Medicare initiative tied to the Affordable Care Act. If Medicare makes further cuts to provider prices, hospitals and physicians may circle their wagons even tighter, leading to yet another wave of integration. The total elimination of commercial insurance may spell the end of antitrust action against providers, if only to transfer the exercise of market power to the political arena. Even with Democrats taking power in the 2020 election, mega providers will still dominate the healthcare landscape, and we will remain worse off for it, unless we figure out how to either eliminate them or make them work for us. That is what this book is about. 1. The evolution of the modern hospital. History never really says goodbye. History says, see you later. Eduardo Galeano. 1. The story of the mega provider begins in the 19th century. Massachusetts General Hospital, the jewel of the Partners system, dates to 1811. The University of Pittsburgh Medical Center's flagship Presbyterian Hospital was founded in 1883, and New York Presbyterian opened in 1868. The 19th century hospital was mostly a place where society cordoned off the sick, not to heal them but to stop the spread of whatever ailed them. Over the course of the next few decades, medical breakthroughs transformed hospitals from places of dying to places of healing. By the second half of the 20th century, hospitals were firmly entrenched as the center of their local community's healthcare world. They spent the next several decades defending their turf while expanding their geographical and service boundaries. They made sure the spigot of healthcare spending opened wider and wider, and that hospitals would continue to receive the lion's share of the dollars. In the process, they discovered a formula that continues to serve them well: make outsized claims on the public purse, ignore efficiencies, and maintain local dominance. To their credit, today's mega providers can work miracles, saving and extending lives, albeit at enormous cost. In the 19th century, there was little that hospitals could do except contain infectious diseases and amputate limbs. And then the era of modern medicine began. A host of innovations, including X-rays, blood typing, and antiseptics, greatly boosted the odds of surviving surgery. Researchers discovered insulin and aspirin, learned how to transfuse blood, developed vaccines against cholera, rabies, and the plague, and introduced treatments for rickets and malaria. If you wanted to benefit from the latest advances, you had to go to a hospital. All these new technologies came at a cost, and only the wealthy could access all that the hospital had to offer. To make matters worse, many physicians lacked the training to administer all the newly available treatments. The Flexner Report of 1910 led to reforms in medical education that further drove up costs by raising the standards and length of training, as well as the required medical school infrastructure. In 1928, a group of leading academics formed the Committee on the Cost of Medicare Care, CCMC, to study the problems plaguing the U.S. health system and to recommend how to fix it. Their report, Healthcare for the American People, condemned the system for high and often wasteful spending that made healthcare inaccessible for most Americans. Point 2, they called for changes that still resonate: health insurance for all Americans, integration of medical providers, payment reform, and an emphasis on prevention. National health insurance was not a new idea. Germany started theirs in the late 19th century. Opposition from the American Medical Association, AMA, and hostility during World War I toward anything German helped quash a similar program in the United States, and by the time of the CCMC report, few Americans had any kind of health insurance beyond compensation for workplace injuries. As the Great Depression took hold, things started to change. Average Americans struggled to pay their medical bills and, as a result, hospitals and doctors struggled to turn a profit. In 1929, the year of the stock market crash, Baylor Hospital in Dallas offered prepaid hospital insurance to local teachers. Soon thereafter, hospitals in New Jersey and Ohio were doing the same. The idea quickly caught on, and by 1940, 56 groups of hospitals were offering insurance plans to 6 million enrollees. These became known as Blue Cross plans, named after a poster for the Minnesota plan that used a blue cross, a variant on the familiar red Geneva cross used to identify medical facilities in wartime. Hospitals created an umbrella organization, the Blue Cross Association, which coordinated the activities of the individual plans. Medical societies soon followed suit, offering Blue Shield plans covering physician services. The non-profit Blue Cross and Blue Shield plans offered nearly unlimited access to all hospitals and doctors, paid full charges, required minimal cost sharing, and left medical decision-making to providers. Following World War II, a combination of economic growth and new medical technologies developed to treat wartime injuries catalyzed further growth in the demand for medical care. As spending accelerated, the need for health insurance intensified. While several European nations introduced national health insurance after the war, the United States continued to rely on private insurers. When the federal government made health insurance benefits tax deductible, employer-sponsored health insurance took off. Enrollments in Blue plans steadily increased, and investor-owned commercial insurers entered the market to compete with them. By the mid-1950s, the majority of Americans had health insurance. These were heady times for hospitals. By 1950, more than 5,000 community hospitals received the largest share of all U.S. health expenditures. 3. The federal Kerr-Mills program funded construction of new hospitals and the expansion of existing hospitals. Private insurers, the biggest of which were sponsored by hospitals and the government, gave hospitals blank checks to spend whatever they deemed necessary to treat their patients. Unsurprisingly, inflation-adjusted health spending increased by 2.6% per year between 1950 and 1980. But there is a time-honored business principle that if someone is making money, someone else will either want a piece of the action or will look to the government to rein them in. Hospitals were not immune to this principle. There is another principle worth noting. When firms are threatened, either by competition or by regulation, there are two very different strategies for survival. The first is to create more value for consumers, find a way to become more efficient, improve the product, or both. The second is to use whatever power they have to subvert the competition and capture the regulators. Faced with competitive and regulatory threats in the mid-20th century, hospitals chose the latter strategy, with considerable success. The challenge from HMOs. In the 1950s there were two anchors to the healthcare system of nearly every big city: large hospitals, some affiliated with medical schools, and Blue Cross Blue Shield insurance plans. Most of the Blue plans were sponsored by providers. Nevertheless, they remained independent community, social welfare organizations, under federal law, which meant that they were supposed to benefit the community as a whole, and not just their sponsors. 4. In trying to meet this obligation, they must have been sorely conflicted. Hospital executives served on the boards of Blue plans and had enormous influence over their strategic direction. Indeed, the American Hospital Association and the National Blue Cross Association were located in the same building, at 840 North Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. Dominating both the provision and financing of medical care, hospitals and physicians had a near stranglehold on the health economy. The social welfare organization label notwithstanding, the Blues structured their insurance policies to benefit providers. They did not question medical bills. They did not close networks. By requiring only minimal cost sharing, they assured that patients would have no financial reason to question their provider's decisions. 5. If you were a provider, life in a Blue-dominated world was good. If you were a patient, life was pretty good too. Doctors and hospitals saved lives, and insurers paid the medical bills. But not everything was rosy. Someone had to pay all these bills, and patients who lacked insurance might have to draw down their life savings or go bankrupt. This was just one way in which the goals of the CCMC remained unmet. Care was still fragmented. Fee-for-service payments promoted overspending, and prevention remained an afterthought. Although not well documented at the time, the quality of care was variable and often substandard. In a few places around the nation, a different way of organizing and paying for medical care was emerging. Health maintenance organizations, HMOs, seemed to be just what the CCMC had ordered. 6 HMOs eliminated fee-for-service incentives and featured teams of physicians working together in groups, and their very name spoke of prevention. By the 1940s, HMOs enjoyed limited success in a few regional pockets, mostly on the West Coast: Ross Luce Medical Group in Los Angeles, Kaiser in California, the Group Health Cooperative, GHC, of Puget Sound, and the Health Insurance Plan of Greater New York. In some places, HMO enrollments rivaled that of commercial insurers. The CCMC's proposals and their embodiment in the form of HMOs represented a major threat to hospitals and doctors. After all, what the CCMC called wasteful spending was income to providers, and what the CCMC called integration was the end of autonomy. Two prominent features of HMO's group practice of physicians and prepayment ran counter to principles published by the AMA in the 1930s. 7 Organized medicine needed to respond. Hospitals and doctors might have worked to curtail spending and improve care coordination, but that would have required rethinking how medical care would be delivered, and might have eaten into provider incomes. Instead, the providers turned to the government for protection. Providers lobbied state governments for a range of regulations restricting HMO growth, including forcing HMOs to have open physician panels, prohibiting HMO advertising, and requiring that physicians constitute all or most of HMO boards. 8 Hospitals and doctors were among the biggest political donors and had sterling reputations among voters, so legislators were more than happy to oblige. In case regulation proved insufficient at deterring HMOs, providers took further steps of an even less salubrious nature. Local medical societies organized boycotts, which denied membership to physicians who participated in HMOs. Hospitals limited admitting privileges to only those physicians who were in good standing with their medical societies. Providers also spread false information about the nature of HMO operations, calling into question, without any evidence, the quality of care that would be provided under socialism, which was a curious way to describe employment in the private sector. 9. Finding it difficult to recruit physicians, HMOs turned to the courts for redress. The Washington-based Group Health Association, GA, HMO provided an important test case. 10 GA was organized in 1937 by employees of the Federal Home Loan Bank. Employees paid monthly subscription fees to the GA health plan, which hired physicians who worked for an elected board. GA represented everything that was anathema to organized medicine: prepaid coverage, salaried physicians, and independent lay control. The AMA and the Medical Society of the District of Columbia asked regulators to ban GA. When that failed, they prevailed on physicians to refuse referrals from GA physicians, and convinced hospitals to stop granting them admitting privileges. The battle between GA and organized medicine received national media attention, and Congress threatened a full-blown investigation. In 1938, the U.S. Department of Justice, DOJ, filed an antitrust claim against GA. A district court convicted the AMA and the Medical Society of the District of Columbia of violating the Sherman Act, and in 1943 the Supreme Court upheld the conviction. Undeterred by this decision, many local medical societies continued to organize boycotts, and HMOs again sought remedy in the courts. In a 1951 case that should have been the last nail in the coffin of organized opposition to HMOs, the GHC of Puget Sound won a boycott claim against the King County Medical Society in Washington state. Neither boycotts, false rumors, nor regulations proved totally effective on their own, but taken together they helped organized medicine achieve its goal. As late as the 1970s, HMOs operated in just 10 states and enrolled just 6 million Americans. This represented slightly more than 3% of all insurance enrollments. 11 Organized medicine had contained the threat from HMOs. Although both authors of this book studied healthcare management in the 1970s, we learned next to nothing about HMOs, which our professors derisively referred to as a West Coast thing. Our professors did not serve us well. In the 1970s things were starting to change, and it would soon be impossible to ignore HMOs. President Nixon gave them a shot in the arm by supporting the HMO Act of 1973, which lent them legitimacy and overrode many state regulations. 12 As HMO enrollment slowly accelerated, organized medicine returned to boycotts. In 1976, the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, successfully challenged a Blue Shield plan that refused payments to HMO physicians in Spokane, Washington. 13 In 1979 the Department of Justice successfully challenged the American Society of Anesthesiologists, which denied membership to physicians who accepted prepayment or salary. 14 In the same year, the FTC ordered Forbes Health System in Pennsylvania to grant privileges to HMO-affiliated physicians, regardless of their standing with medical societies. 15 Organized medicine finally got the message and ended the boycotts. Organized medicine suffered another blow in the 1980s, when many Blue Cross plans established their own HMOs to compete with the growing roster of for-profit entrants, mostly concentrated on the coasts, like HealthNet and Pacificare on the West Coast, and US Healthcare on the East Coast. Unlike Kaiser and GHC, these new HMOs were not a true fusion of insurer and provider. They were insurers first and foremost, and they did not own hospitals or employ physicians. Instead, they contracted with a wider panel of local providers and paid primary care physicians, PCPs, by capitation, which gave them modest incentives to hold down medical costs. Insurer-sponsored HMOs not only grew rapidly over the next decade, but consolidated, gaining bargaining leverage against providers. HMOs were met by a furious patient backlash in the 1990s. Enrollees balked at access restrictions and questioned HMO quality, and organized medicine threw its weight behind hundreds of legislative proposals to weaken if not cripple HMOs, including any willing provider and freedom of choice requirements, which research has since tied to higher prices. 16 Organized medicine also sought to eliminate gag rules that prevented physicians from advocating for treatments that HMOs did not approve. It had nearly achieved all its goals in 1998 when President Clinton proposed a patient bill of rights, which fell victim to the partisan politics of the time. Despite all of these efforts to stop them, HMOs survived. Their enrollments peaked in the 1990s, when less restrictive preferred provider organizations gained favor. Recently, HMO enrollments have fallen in percentage terms, but they have hardly disappeared. Today, more than 90 million Americans are enrolled in HMOs, aided in part by a steady increase in Medicare and Medicaid enrollments. 17. Many of today's most successful HMOs have been around more than 50 years. Kaiser, with more than 12 million members, is the gold standard not just for HMOs, but for all integrated health systems. On the West Coast, its closed panel of salaried physicians, Kaiser Permanente medical groups, practicing exclusively at Kaiser-owned hospitals and outpatient facilities, purportedly delivers medical care at a fraction of the cost of other health providers, with arguably comparable or superior quality. It is no wonder that advocates of integration point to Kaiser as proof of concept, even as other systems fail to perform up to Kaiser's standards. As we will discuss, Kaiser itself has not always performed up to its own standards, especially when it attempted to expand beyond its West Coast base. For much of the 20th century, organized medicine's reaction to HMOs was consistent and predictable. Unwilling to accept changes that threatened their dominance, doctors and hospitals used their market clout and political power to preserve the status quo. As new challenges emerged, doctors and hospitals found other ways to protect themselves that we detail in later chapters. Regulatory threats. Before 1960, government largely stayed out of healthcare markets. The most important policies that emerged after World War II: preferential tax treatment for employer-sponsored health insurance, and the 1948 Hill-Burton program for hospital construction pumped money into the healthcare system with few strings attached. 18 Whenever the federal government attempted to directly provide health insurance, organized medicine objected. When President Truman offered a plan for national health insurance, the AMA called White House staffers followers of the Moscow Party line. 2 decades later, the AMA would strongly oppose the creation of Medicare and Medicaid among other things, paying for a recording titled, "Ronald Reagan Speaks Out Against Socialized Medicine." 20. Medicare and Medicaid did survive as key parts of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. By reducing the fraction of Americans without health insurance from nearly 25% to under 15%, these programs proved to be a boon to hospitals and physicians. Supply rose to meet the dramatic increase in demand. Between 1965 and 1975, the number of hospital beds swelled by 27%. 21 hospitals also added an arsenal of new and costly medical services, and increasingly linked up with university-based medical schools to form academic medical centers. By 1973, 400 hospitals had CT scanners, while 500 performed coronary artery graft with bypass procedures. 22 Subsequent technology enhancements included joint replacements, balloon catheterization, LASIK eye surgery, radiation therapy, and organ transplants. While large academic medical centers were expected to embrace new technologies, many other, community, hospitals got the technology bug and emulated them. The United States would need more doctors to deliver all these services, and medical school enrollments swelled by 40% in the 1970s. 23 At the same time, the federal government and state medical societies lifted restrictions on immigration and postgraduate training of foreign medical graduates. When Medicaid and Medicare started in 1966, the United States had about 300,000 physicians. By 1980 there were over 460,000. 24 Nearly all of the increase was in specialists, with the ratio of specialists to generalists increasing from roughly 1:1 to nearly 2:1. With more hospitals, more specialists, better technology, and more insurance to pay for it, total U.S. healthcare spending rose from 6% of GDP in 1965 to 10% in 1982. This placed enormous strains on government budgets. Medicare quickly became the largest purchaser of healthcare in the United States, and Medicaid was the first or second largest budget item in most states, after education. Looking to reduce health expenditures, governments took aim at hospitals, which were the biggest drivers of health spending, accounting for roughly 36% of national health expenditures in 1970. New York, which had a large Medicaid program, led the way by introducing a prospective payment program that paid per diem rates, i.e., a fixed payment per hospital day, dictated by the state. 7 other states soon followed suit, adding a few wrinkles to the payment rules. Medicare and private insurers in these states joined in, creating all-payer programs. These proved modestly successful at containing costs, reducing annual hospital inflation by 1 or 2 percentage points. 26 They might have been even more effective had hospitals not figured out how to game the system. Hospitals in New York offset reduced per diem payments by increasing the number of diems, that is, they increased the length of stays. In other states that used different payment rules, hospitals found different ways to adjust. It did not help when health management training programs began teaching students how to exploit loopholes in payment rules. By 1980, hospitals accounted for 39.4% of national health expenditures. Hospital rate setting gave payers their first taste of the balloon principle. If you squeeze one part of the healthcare spending balloon, other parts expand. When payers squeezed the price they would pay for a hospital day, hospitals responded by increasing the number of days. Payers learned that they needed to squeeze the entire balloon and not just one end. Medicare's prospective payment system, PPS, introduced in 1983, featured a fixed fee per admission, with the fee adjusted for the patient's medical condition and treatment, classified into 470 diagnosis-related groups, DRGs. Many state Medicaid programs followed Medicare's lead, as did most private insurers. By the end of the 1980s, nearly all payers were squeezing the entire hospital stay, not just one day. This forced hospitals to analyze and then manage care patterns for each DRG, to avoid ruinous losses. The move to the PPS had immediate results. Medicare spending per hospital admission fell by 10% in just 2 years, and hospital expenditures fell back to 34.7% of national health expenditures by 1990. Even so, there was no way to contain the entire healthcare balloon, as hospitals found creative ways to game the DRG system. Many hospitals exploited subjectivity in diagnostic coding to move patients into more remunerative DRGs. 27 This upcoding was particularly pronounced in for-profit hospitals. Hospitals shifted some diagnostic work to outpatient facilities, and discharged patients early under the care of hospital-owned or affiliated home health agencies and skilled nursing facilities. The latter phenomenon was derisively referred to as discharging patients, quicker but sicker. Unbundling services in these ways enabled hospitals to receive outpatient and home care payments in addition to the fixed DRG payments. They also reduced their inpatient mortality rates, which were being publicly reported, without actually saving any lives. In the 2000s, hospitals moved chronically ill patients out of inpatient beds into their own long-term care facilities, which often were little more than repurposed inpatient wings. One study suggests that this tactic accounts for 1/3 or more of the recent growth in long-term care. 28. It seems obvious that if you want to shrink the size of a balloon, you cannot squeeze it, you have to let the air out of it. For the healthcare balloon, that means you cannot just cap spending in just one or a handful of service areas, you have to reduce the total amount of dollars available for all care. At the risk of pushing the analogy too hard, you also have to make sure you do not let out too much air, or you will not have much of a balloon. This means not cutting spending too much, lest quality suffers. 29. While government payers used rate setting to squeeze one part of the balloon, insurer-sponsored HMOs turned to capitation in an effort to squeeze the whole balloon at once. Under capitation, insurers paid providers a fixed fee per patient, or per head, hence the name. Providers could only profit by holding spending below the capitated amount, and could actually lose money if spending got out of hand. Ideally, HMOs would hold providers financially accountable for all health spending. This proved impractical for several reasons. For starters, HMOs could not figure out how to assign patients to specialists and hospitals, so they restricted capitation to primary care physicians. Many PCPs balked at taking on so much financial risk, especially if they were held responsible for all the expenses of catastrophically ill patients. Ultimately, HMOs restricted capitated payments to PCP's own office expenses, medications, and office fees for some specialist referrals. Limited in this way, capitation also fell victim to the balloon principle, as it left specialists free to order expensive tests and procedures, and had no impact on hospital spending. Meanwhile, many patients wondered whether their PCPs were skimping on services covered by the capitated fee. Capitation of PCPs has since morphed into global capitation, in which payers give health systems a single annual fee meant to cover all medical services, coupled with quality of care incentives meant to discourage skimping. In this way, payers incentivize the system to squeeze the entire balloon, but not squeeze too hard. This just passes the buck, as now it falls to the system to push incentives down to its member physicians. A few organizations, like Kaiser, seem to have figured out how to make this work, with a lot of help from a closed delivery system and an in-house insurance arm. Most have not, however, for reasons we will explore later in this book. At the same time that states were experimenting with price controls, they were also attempting to limit supply. It is unclear whether the resulting regulations were intended to hold down spending or maintain the status quo. New York again led the way. The Metcalfe-McCloskey Act of 1964 protected New York hospitals by requiring all proposed healthcare facilities to obtain a certificate of need, CON, from a politically appointed regional health planning board. The board was supposed to deny applications when supply exceeded needs, as determined by epidemiological studies. The CON was heavily influenced by Romer's Law, named after epidemiologist Milt Romer, whose research showed a correlation between the number of beds built and the number of beds filled. 30 If supply creates its own demand, as Romer was suggesting, then one way to curb demand, and therefore curb health spending, would be to limit supply. At the same time, this would allow the handful of providers who did receive CONs to benefit from economies of scale. The theory was reasonable, and by 1972, 19 states had CON laws. 2 years later, Congress passed the National Health Planning and Resources Development Act, which required all states to follow the New York model. To the surprise of many, hospitals and the Blue Cross plans they sponsored were among the biggest proponents of CON. 31 Fearful of rate setting and other regulatory controls, the medical establishment viewed the planning process as a way to legitimize the status quo. According to legal scholars Sally Ann Payton and Rhoda Pausner, the hospital and public health establishments shared a common ideology, the idea of a regional healthcare system with a large teaching hospital at its center and with all other elements of the healthcare system as satellites. 32 This is a prescient description of today's mega providers. CON would help pave the way. Unfortunately, the CON process was not so much an exercise in health planning as it was a lesson in how local politics protected incumbents. 33 In order to win CON approval for a new hospital, applicants spent millions on lawyers and consultants to prepare lengthy CON applications. This favored deep-pocketed incumbents, and deterred many potential entrants. Entrants who could afford the legal fees and consulting studies faced an even bigger barrier, gaining board approval. On the designated day for the CON hearing, the applicant would present its proposal to the board. Incumbent hospitals lined up against them, presenting their own consulting studies purportedly showing that the community did not need a new hospital. Many incumbents hoarded unused bed licenses, which gave them authority from the state to expand without CON. These hospitals promised that they would use their licenses to meet growing demand, provided that the board reject the outsider's application. Some kept their promises. Others kept their licenses in reserve, in order to block future applications. The deck was stacked against the applicants. A key principle we will repeat throughout this book is that healthcare is local. Hospitals held enormous sway in their local communities. They were often the most respected local institutions. They were among the largest employers. Business leaders vied for prestigious seats on local hospital boards. All of this gave local hospitals political clout. Planning board members gained nothing for their political handlers if they approved outsiders' proposals, and would gain the enthusiastic support of their clout-heavy constituents if they said no. Board members never questioned whether their local hospitals offered high-quality care or operated efficiently. They always questioned the applicant. All of this is still true today. Politics being what it is, the politicized health planning process sometimes went off the rails. Illinois has one of the most corrupt political cultures, and not even health planning could escape its long tentacles. In 2004, Edward Hospital in Naperville applied for a CON to build a satellite hospital in nearby Plainfield. The hearing was open to the public, and the audience witnessed quite a spectacle. After Edward Hospital made its case, the planning board began its deliberations. After just a few minutes, one board member, banker Stuart Levine, walked around the table and appeared to whisper in the ears of several other members. Moments later, the board denied Edward's application. Edward Hospital's president, Pamela Davis, approached the board, told them things were going to change, and then stormed out of the room. Few knew it at the time, but Davis was guarding a secret. Shortly before the hearing, she had met with a banking executive and a construction company president. They had told her that CON approval hinged on whether she used their firms. Anticipating such shenanigans, Davis had been in touch with the FBI and she had come to the meeting wearing a wire. This soon all came to light. The banker and construction company president pled guilty to various felonies, explaining that they paid millions of dollars to Levine for other CON-related contracts and expected similar demands from Levine if the board approved the Edward deal. Levine allegedly passed on some of this money to Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich in exchange for placing Levine on the board. Levine pleaded guilty to multiple counts of corruption. He spent 5.5 years in federal prison, a term that might have been longer had Levine not testified against Blagojevich in the latter's criminal corruption trial. Trump commuted Blagojevich's sentence in February 2020. The thought of politicians exercising so much power over 1/5 of the economy should send shivers down the spine of everyone, at least everyone who lives in Illinois. But it doesn't. Most state hospital associations and many local healthcare systems still support CON. Even so, CON is hardly the incumbent protector that it once was. In the deregulatory atmosphere of the 1980s, most states eased or eliminated CON rules. CON remains in effect in 35 states, but is thought to have teeth in only a handful. 20 years after the introduction of Medicaid and Medicare, hospitals were sitting pretty. They had navigated the potential pitfalls of rate setting, they were exempt from the cost-cutting incentives created when HMOs capitated PCPs, and, thanks to CON, they enjoyed protection from competition. Their success could be seen in the data. In 1965 the average hospital had 129 beds. Over the next 2 decades, while CON was in full force, the average hospital grew to 175 beds. While many small rural and inner-city hospitals closed, big hospitals thrived. If one were to compare a list of largest hospitals in 1965 against the same list in 1985, there would be a startling amount of overlap. Many could trace their roots to the 19th century. The same hospitals dominate today's landscape. One is hard-pressed to identify any institutions, aside from hospitals, that have dominated their local markets for so long. As the healthcare system evolved away from inpatient care, big hospitals were positioned to transform themselves into mega providers. Before doing so, they would have to gain control of the emerging market for outpatient surgery. The threat from outpatient surgery. Throughout most of the last century, surgery required an extended stay in a hospital. In the early 1970s, a few hospitals repurposed existing wings as ambulatory surgery centers, ASCs, where they offered one-day care for some simple procedures such as hernia repairs and appendectomies. Patients could enter a separate hospital entrance, with separate parking, in the morning, have their surgery by noon, and be home for dinner. Like customers of auto paint shops that advertised at the time, you could get in by 9, out by 5. In 1970, Wallace Reed and John Ford opened the ch2 Center in Phoenix, the first independent, freestanding ASC. Patients had many reasons to love freestanding ASCs. They were less threatening, easier to get to, easier to get in and out of, and less expensive. Payers, both public and private, encouraged their growth as a lower-cost alternative to hospitalization. Many doctors enjoyed the freedom and financial success that came with owning an ASC. In addition to professional fees, they received a portion of the facility fees. Before long, everyone, including hospitals, could see the potential for ASCs to disrupt the inpatient marketplace. In a famous Harvard Business Review article, prominent health policy analyst Jeff Goldsmith argued that the threat from ASCs was existential. The hospital is the core institutional provider of healthcare. Yet as their costs increase, hospitals will be in an increasingly vulnerable position within the healthcare market. 34 Goldsmith seemed prescient. At the time the article appeared in 1980, there were about 200 ASCs. By 1988 there were more than 1,000. 35 ongoing innovations in anesthetics and surgical techniques now make it possible for ASCs to perform 2/3 of all surgeries. What Goldsmith did not fully anticipate was that ASCs presented an opportunity for hospitals. A simple procedure such as a hernia repair can seem daunting to patients. Patients preferred providers with established reputations for quality, and didn't mind if the ASC adjoined a hospital, in case something went wrong. This gave a huge demand-side advantage to local hospitals over upstart ASCs. Once they got the cost accounting figured out, hospitals realized that their own ASCs were often more efficient as well. As a result, hospital-based ASCs proliferated. The percentage of community hospitals with organized outpatient departments tripled from 26% in 1975 to 77% in 1988, when same-day surgeries accounted for 15% of all hospital-based surgeries. 36. Not satisfied with this competitive advantage, some hospitals threw their weight around, refusing to contract with insurers unless they were granted exclusivity over outpatient surgery. Insurers needed to offer attractive hospital networks to win market share, and that meant contracting with most if not all local hospitals, and especially with the largest and most sought-after health systems. Insurers acquiesced to the demands for exclusivity, which prompted many ASCs to take legal action, claiming that hospitals were using their power in local markets to exclude competition. In a series of decisions that anticipated the outcomes of hospital merger cases a decade later, courts repeatedly dismissed the cases. Courts agreed with the hospitals that competition was not local, appearances to the contrary. It seems that when it came to defining the extent of the market, hospital markets did not satisfy the Duck test. These markets looked local, but the courts ruled otherwise. We will explain, but not defend, the court's twisted logic in Chapter 4. These rulings helped assure that dominant hospitals would remain that way, and they had a chilling effect on entry by startup ASCs. Several factors have helped level the playing field for independent ASCs. ASC management companies emerged in the 1980s and 1990s to give entrepreneurial physicians the requisite management expertise and financial capital to compete with hospitals. Patients became more accepting of freestanding ASCs, many prefer dealing with them to navigating the campus of a large hospital. Insurers have taken a harder line against exclusivity, and courts are more willing to find that hospitals possess market power. Unfortunately, in the last decade mega providers have found ways to protect themselves from competition that seem less susceptible to antitrust claims. We will discuss these in Chapter 7. At the same time, many medical groups have had financial trouble and have turned to hospitals to purchase their assets, including their ASCs. As a result, many of the surgeons who used to compete against hospitals have now joined them, choosing the security of employment over the risks of entrepreneurship. Selective contracting. As powerful as they were, hospitals and medical associations were not the largest healthcare organizations in their markets, as measured either in dollars or customers. Health insurers were larger, especially the Blues. In 1980, big academic medical centers like Massachusetts General Hospital and New York Presbyterian each had about $150 to $200 million in revenues and treated upwards of 40,000 inpatients. 37 By contrast, Blue Cross of Massachusetts and Empire Blue Cross of New York each had around $1 billion in revenues from nearly 2 million subscribers. 38 Despite their massive size advantage, insurers had virtually no leverage over providers. Whether for strategic reasons or state laws, insurers paid for all medical care given by all providers, no questions asked. Narrow networks were restricted to closed-panel HMOs. Patients had minimal out-of-pocket expenses and did not shy away from expensive providers. As a result, every provider, even small community hospitals and solo physicians, could price like a monopolist. 39 This was the rationale behind state rate setting. Some private insurers tried to rein in spending through fee schedules and prospective payment. These tactics were no more successful than government rate controls. The power relationship between payers and providers changed with the arrival of selective contracting in the 1980s. The history of selective contracting has been told elsewhere, so we will only provide a thumbnail sketch. 40 During the 1980s, states dropped decades-old regulations that required insurers to reimburse all licensed providers. Insurers responded by creating preferred provider organizations, PPOs, whose central feature was a network of contracting providers. Patients paid substantial out-of-pocket costs if they ventured outside the network, which meant that out-of-network providers could lose enormous market share. Insurers used this threat to negotiate discounts off of providers' usual charges. Most providers preferred to be in-network at a discount, rather than out-of-network at full price, so most PPO networks ended up including most providers. Able to obtain lower cost coverage without surrendering access, enrollees flocked to PPOs. Starting from essentially zero in 1983, the number of PPO enrollees rose to 28 million in 1987 and to 50 million by 1995. Large corporate employers were especially eager to build their health benefits packages around PPOs. Employers financed much of the rising cost of healthcare generated after the passage of Medicare, and some pundits quipped that the cost of employee insurance coverage exceeded the cost of steel used in Detroit automobiles. 41 The Employee Retirement and Income Security Act, ERISA, of 1974 provided further impetus for PPOs. ERISA meant that self-insured employers could avoid state insurance taxes and mandated benefits. Employers embraced the PPO model because it allowed them to directly receive provider discounts while avoiding costly regulations. Some employers shopped around for a more stringent cost containment solution, and found it in the HMOs that had already staked a place in their markets. Employers enlisted the help of their insurance carriers to develop new HMO plans, and either pushed or enticed employees to join them. Between 1984 and 1996, the share of employees in large firms enrolled in HMO plans jumped from 8 to 33%. 42 Thanks to both PPOs and HMOs, this was a period of near-zero inflation-adjusted growth in private healthcare spending, something we have not achieved before or since. By the end of the 1990s, roughly 70% of employees with employer-based health insurance were enrolled in either an HMO or a PPO plan. The growth in private sector managed care began to spread to the public sector. State Medicaid programs nudged their enrollees into managed care plans, usually HMOs, in the early 1990s. Between 1983 and 1993, the percentage of Medicaid enrollees in managed care plans rose from 1 to 15%. 43 Medicare moved more slowly toward managed care, propelled by the Tax Equity and Fiscal Responsibility Act, 1982, and the Balanced Budget Act of 1997. Today, 1 in 3 Medicare beneficiaries is in a private HMO or PPO. 44. By the early 1990s, hospitals and physicians had lost their monopoly pricing power. If anything, insurers acted as if all providers were interchangeable, much like barrels of oil or bushels of wheat. Playing one provider off against another for network inclusion, insurers demanded and obtained discounts of 20% or more. While small hospitals were especially at risk, even the largest hospitals, some of which had dominated their markets for a century or longer, faced unprecedented competitive pressures. Hospitals were unlikely to find a friend in the government, where Medicare and Medicaid were exploiting economic incentives to hold down spending. Hospitals knew that if they were to continue to dominate the health economy, they had 3 options: become more efficient, find new sources of revenue, or regain pricing power. Seemingly overnight, a remedy emerged that encompassed all 3, the integrated delivery network. Success would prove elusive, however. Coda and Preview. In the rest of this book we describe how providers have created ever larger organizations in a quest to improve care delivery and meet the competitive challenge created by insurers, the companies they originally sponsored. While hospitals and insurers seem to be at each other's throats, the two sides have a symbiotic relationship in which both have thrived. Success does not imply omniscience or beneficence, however. Even the most successful firms often make poor business decisions, and when challenged by competitive pressures, they tend to circle the wagons at the expense of consumers. Doctors and hospitals are not exempt from these truths, and we must resist placing them upon a pedestal. The facts, as we explain below, are not always kind to our medical providers. 2. From hospital to health system. Successful enterprises are built from the ground up. You can't assemble them with a bunch of acquisitions. Louis V. Gerstner, Jr. 1. Throughout much of the 20th century, hospitals used their clout to fight off external pressures. By the 1990s, they seemed to have lost their influence as Medicare, Medicaid, and PPOs all squeezed payments. Hospitals needed a fresh approach, and they found it in an idea that some academics had been touting more than a decade. They called it vertical integration. The first wave of vertical integration began in earnest in the early 1990s and took many forms. Hospitals integrated with physicians, hospitals and physicians integrated with health plans, and physicians integrated with equity-backed physician practice management firms. Adding to the complexity, in some cases the merging parties combined into a single firm, whereas at other times their relationships were purely contractual. The latter arrangement was called virtual integration. Other than Kaiser and a handful of other HMOs, these combinations were new to healthcare. The vertical integration movement of the 1990s was a direct response to the trends of the 1980s. Medicare prospective payment placed new financial strains on hospitals. Independent outpatient surgery centers were luring away profitable patients. Employers eager to find low-cost insurance options embraced HMOs and PPOs, which successfully demanded discounts from all providers. Capitation became the rage as a new payment method that threatened the viability of some providers, while others saw it an opportunity to make vast profits if only they could figure out how to contain costs. These conditions provided a combustible mix to fuel vertical integration. The only thing lacking was a spark. Managed competition. To understand the vertical integration movement, we need to go back a bit earlier. Like every decade before and since, the 1970s saw rising healthcare costs and uneven access to care. In 1972, Senator Ted Kennedy proposed a single-payer healthcare system that would rely on co-insurance to constrain spending growth. With Richard Nixon in the White House, the proposal had no chance of becoming a reality. Even so, it forced Nixon to offer a counter-proposal, the HMO Act of 1974, which breezed through Congress and catalyzed the growth of HMOs but fell short of reorganizing healthcare delivery or expanding insurance coverage. In the 1980s and early 1990s, several academics, led by Stanford University's Alon Inthoven and Northwestern University's Stephen Shortell, offered market-based solutions to the cost and access problems. 2 Inthoven, a Stanford professor and an advisor to Kaiser, called his approach managed competition, and the term stuck. Today, managed competition is embodied in health insurance exchanges set up under the Affordable Care Act. As Inthoven and Shortell described it, the idea was for local governments to promote organized delivery systems that would compete against each other in a well-regulated marketplace. The managed competition movement picked up momentum in the early 1990s when the concept was endorsed by an informal network of executives, physicians, academics, including Inthoven, and policy wonks known as the Jackson Hole Group, who met regularly in the Wyoming home of their leader, Paul Elwood. Point 3 While these efforts further stimulated employer interest and employee enrollment in managed care plans, they spooked healthcare providers. It did not help that all of the groups discussing reform deliberated in secret. Providers sensed that something portentous was coming their way, and began wondering how they should respond. Propulsion from the public sector. Rapid political changes reinforced this perception. The 1991-92 recession brought several Democrats to prominence and, with them, calls for healthcare reform. In 1991, the former president of Bryn Mawr College, Harris Wofford, won election to the U.S. Senate from Pennsylvania with the promise of healthcare reform. The following year, Senator Bob Kerrey of Nebraska built his presidential campaign around the promise of universal coverage. Another presidential candidate, former Senator Paul Tsongas of Massachusetts, began talking in New Hampshire meeting halls about restructuring the healthcare marketplace. The presidential sweepstakes got even more interesting when billionaire Ross Perot exited, and then re-entered the race and published his own healthcare reform, ultimately siphoning off enough votes to hand the 1992 election to Bill Clinton, who won with 43% of the popular vote. 4. Clinton's election served as the tipping point. The efforts of the Jackson Hole Group were now supplemented by a series of working groups with hundreds of members, formed by Hillary Clinton and her policy advisor, IRA Magaziner. Together, they developed a national health reform proposal in 1993 known as the Health Security Act, also known as the Clinton Health Plan. 5. Loosely following the Inthoven and Shortell blueprint, the Clinton plan called for a massive restructuring in the payment and delivery of health care, including 1. State-level, regional health alliances that would purchase care on behalf of nearly all the non-Medicare population, 2. Health plans organized by local providers and insurers, and 3. Fee schedules set by the alliances, which would serve as price controls. The Clinton plan bore some resemblance to voluntary arrangements passed in a few states, Washington, Florida, and Minnesota. It had no shortage of well-regarded academics working on Hillary Clinton's task forces, many of whom would go on to work on Obama's Affordable Care Act, and it enjoyed the endorsement of 500 economists who praised the legislation. To skeptics, it was eerily reminiscent of the 450 prophets of Baal who led people astray. 6. The Clinton plan dominated the headlines for nearly 2 years. This long gestation period gave providers, and the consultants who advised them, a lot of time to mull over its implications. What seemed clear to everyone was that transformation of the payment system from fee-for-service to capitation and managed care was at hand, with concomitant changes in the delivery system to follow shortly. 7 Self-proclaimed healthcare futurist Russell Coyle opined that this transformation would be largely completed by the end of the decade. 8 While the Clinton plan died on arrival in Congress in the spring of 1994, it nevertheless frightened providers into a variety of integration efforts. As Coyle explained in 1995, American healthcare is being restructured, re-engineered, and reinvented in a new systems model, the integrated delivery network. 9. The logics of healthcare market evolution. Provider integration was not just a response to proposed healthcare reforms. It was cast as an inevitable evolutionary progression toward the promised land, progressive managed care as in states such as California and Minnesota. The California marketplace featured Kaiser, as well as large primary care-dominated medical groups, aggressive purchasers, CalPERS, which managed benefits for retired state employees, and the Pacific Business Group on Health, which represented large employers, widespread use of capitation, and relatively low health insurance premiums. According to one analyst, by 1995 there were 15 medical groups in California reporting that 90 to 95% of their revenues were capitated. 10 The Twin Cities marketplace included another large employer coalition, Buyers Healthcare Action Group, large medical groups, one of the earliest community-based prepaid plans, Group Health, established in 1957, and nascent integrated systems. It was often referred to on the speaker circuit as the Mesopotamia of managed care. The natural presumption was that the rest of the nation would soon replicate what was happening in these vanguard states. As various observers put it, California, here you come, or, as California goes, so goes the nation. Capitated payments and integrated staff/group HMOs would dominate the landscape. Everyone would be like Kaiser. It did not matter that primary care physicians were the only ones who were heavily capitated in these states, while specialists and hospitals remained stuck in the fee-for-service world. Nor did it matter that Kaiser's regional market share had held steady at around 30% for decades. Instead, analysts assumed that large medical groups and HMOs had unlocked the mystery of value creation, and they focused on the strategies those organizations employed to manage capitated risk. Hospital executives started thinking, if Kaiser can do it, why can't I? This evolutionary theme provided fodder for frameworks, the lifeblood of many of the strategic management consultants who were advising hospitals. Drawing on the experience of California and Minneapolis, futurist Coyle posited the 5 stages of managed care, basically suggesting a huge domino effect. 11 Pressures from employers for premium reductions would motivate managed care payers to consolidate and then use their market power to impose capitation and utilization review on providers, thus reducing the latter's volumes and payments. In response, providers would develop new delivery models and strategies, including horizontal and vertical integration, and would exert pressure on their upstream suppliers. It did not matter that there was no evidence for such a domino effect. No one in the health policy and management communities questioned it. Research published a decade later demonstrated that there was no causal impact of insurer consolidation on provider consolidation. In fact, there was scarcely any insurer consolidation. Rather, it was the fear among providers that managed care was coming that drove their integration efforts. 12. Evolutionary models abounded. Starting in 1993, the University Health System Consortium, UHC, co-developed a model, with a consulting firm, APM, to classify the urban markets of its hospital members. 13 The model hypothesized the existence of 4 market stages: unstructured, loose framework, consolidation, and managed competition. The last was renamed hyper-competitive in 1996, a curious term, for, as we will soon see, this stage involved a small number of big organizations, not exactly the recipe for hyper-competition. These 4 stages were driven by intensifying managed care pressures and the emergence of capitated payment. Providers had to increasingly organize and integrate as markets evolved through these 4 stages. As one analysis described it. 14. In stage 1, there is very little managed care, 0 to 10% penetration. Without pressure to reduce costs, there is little movement among hospitals or physicians to horizontally integrate. In stage 2, HMO penetration of 11 to 30%, HMOs and other payers demand and obtain discounts. In response, hospitals begin to consolidate to augment their bargaining power with payers. A growing number of physicians, particularly primary care, also organize in groups. Overall, however, relationships among providers remain informal. In stage 3, there is further HMO penetration as well as consolidation among HMOs. HMOs increasingly drop certain physicians and hospitals from their panels to lower their contracting costs. In response, providers increasingly form horizontally integrated systems to improve their bargaining power and to increase scale economies and geographic coverage to attract payers. Payers also begin to shift the risk of care to providers through the use of withholds and capitated payments. In response, physicians organize to accept and manage risk. In addition, physician groups and hospitals link together in vertically integrated networks. In stage 4, managed care and capitated payments dominate the market, 50% or more HMO penetration. Providers and payers have consolidated, leaving few healthcare players. There is also continued pressure to develop a full continuum of care outside the hospital's walls. Providers and insurers organize to serve covered lives in response to the incentives of capitated payments. The model caught on with consultants, who classified urban markets into these 4 stages to let hospital executives know where they stood and where they were going. They claimed that most major markets were already stage 3 and stage 4 markets, so the pressure was really on. This 4-stage model had an enormous impact on the hospital industry. It was the subject of many presentations at various symposia on integrated healthcare, held dozens of times across the nation. Hospital executives commonly referred to their geographies as stage X markets. It was replicated in the publications of professional societies like the American College of Healthcare Executives, and consulting firms like the Advisory Board 15. It was mimicked by hospital associations, one of which issued a report on the 4 phases of delivery system integration, from fee-for-service to managed payment to organized care and to accountable care. 16. The evolutionary frameworks appeared in peer-reviewed academic research, and in at least one major book. 17. Seemingly overnight. Everyone knew where healthcare was heading, toward integration. Case studies as the new evidence base. According to these evolutionary logics, if a hospital was to survive, it would have to employ massive numbers of PCPs, develop ambulatory care networks with outpatient surgery centers in every cranny of their community, coordinate care, manage specialty referrals and inpatient admissions, and, most importantly, assemble a large enough base of providers and covered lives to manage capitated risk. They might even have to become insurers in their own right. Only through these massive changes could a hospital transform into an integrated delivery network, IDN. Consultants advised hospitals to emulate the early movers, mainly from the West Coast and Minnesota, whose experiences were formalized in compilations of case studies and distillations of case study lessons, many authored by the consultant Dean Coddington and his associates. 18. Trade industry publications such as the Integrated Healthcare Report contained additional case studies on progress made along the way to stage 4. None of these cases expressed any criticism or skepticism. Like their counterparts at the Harvard Business School, case study writers received access to companies in exchange for describing their history, structure, accomplishments, and successes. 19. Case writers often buried all too brief discussions of issues and challenges. Case studies are a useful tool for teaching concepts to MBA students, but are less useful as an empirical foundation for committing vast resources to new business ventures. Whether in medicine or in business, case studies are the weakest form of evidence, offering a single data point about the poor health of a patient, or the great success of a business, while inviting the reader to choose among multiple possible explanations. Consider Kaiser. Is it successful because it is vertically integrated? Or is it because of the way it recruits and compensates physicians? Is its success path-dependent, so that Kaiser's history is a key contributor? Does it matter that Kaiser largely operates in tech-savvy and highly educated communities? There is just not enough information to determine which of these explanations, if any, are valid. One picks one's preferred answer and invests accordingly, at one's peril. This is far from the only problem with case studies. They are often biased due to the reluctance of struggling organizations to put themselves under the microscope. In the 1990s we learned about successful firms that integrated. The unsuccessful integrating firms, and there were many of them, kept their failures to themselves. The one abject failure that we profile at length in the next chapter, AHERF, came to our attention through bankruptcy proceedings. To make matters worse, predicting future performance based on prior case studies becomes more perilous the further out one projects. The Harvard Case Study Library is filled with exemplars of excellence whose fortunes turn soon after publication. This problem was intensified in healthcare, where consultants and futurists were predicting events that would unfold in 5, 10, or even 20 years' time in a remarkably complex sector of the economy where predicting 1 year ahead is fraught with difficulty. Eager to counter the threats from government regulations and private insurers, providers believed the predictions. Cover from academic research. Joint research conducted by consultants and academics provided a veneer of credibility to the evolutionary frameworks and the march to integrated healthcare they forecast. Many of these investigations resembled the laudatory case studies mentioned above. 20 others were based in academic theories of organizational sociology, such as the Health Systems Integration Study, HSIS, conducted by academic faculty at Northwestern University and consultants at Deloitte. 21 These researchers conducted a multi-year investigation of several organized delivery systems. They conceptualized integration as a house with a foundation of functional integration, layered with physician system integration, and capped off by clinical integration. Surveys of their hospitals served as the data for some of the first empirical, peer-reviewed studies of IDNs. The powerful role of academia in spreading IDN fervor was on display at a 1991 meeting for hospital executives at the Kellogg School of Management, hosted by Stephen Shortell. 22 At the meeting, Shortell explained how the U.S. healthcare system was fragmented into self-interested components: hospitals, physicians, therapists, home health agencies, pharmacies, insurers, and so forth. Each component tried to maximize its own success, without regard for patients' overall needs or total medical spending. This created an opportunity for organizations that could combine the disparate components and take full responsibility for costs and outcomes, what we today call risk contracting and population health. The result would be a community of providers dedicated to keeping patients healthy and, when illness struck, coordinating care to achieve maximum outcomes at minimum cost. In his research and writings, Shortell speculated that many different types of organizations could successfully coordinate care. 23 Both hospitals and physician groups could organize integrated systems. Providers could also achieve significant degrees of coordination through virtual integration, implying that it was not necessary to merge into a single corporate structure. At the meeting, Shortell cited the potential for hospital-led IDNs to revolutionize care delivery and stay at the forefront of market evolution. To the ears of the executives in attendance, this was nothing less than academic certified IDN Kool-Aid. They went back to their hospitals convinced that integration was the future of healthcare. In no time at all, they were transforming the healthcare landscape. Shortell was not the only academic preaching the virtues of coordinated care, and there were countless other hospital executives who heard similar sermons and responded in similar fashion. Academic enthusiasm for integration was accompanied, and perhaps fueled, by press coverage of integrated systems. The press had no shortage of pro-IDN opinions to draw on from academics, consultants, futurists, and various think tanks. Hospital executives who attended academic seminars and industry symposia, listened to the consultants, or simply read the trade magazines heard the same mantra so many times that they assumed it must be true: to succeed, you must integrate. Coverage in the leading trade magazine, Modern Healthcare, is a case in point. In 1991 the magazine published less than one article a month about IDNs. 24 Things started to change near the end of 1992, when the magazine noted the growing academic support for integration in an article titled, Seamless Delivery, Integrated Approach Gets Experts Vote. 25 Modern Healthcare kept its pulse on the trend, and by 1994 articles on IDNs were appearing 10 times a month, a tenfold increase in coverage. Executives following this lavish coverage surely felt they had to either hop on the IDN bandwagon or get hopelessly left behind. Shortell put it this way: the danger of waiting is that others may have beaten you to the punch, leaving you with a long, uphill struggle. 26. Some academics refused to get on board. Some noted the lack of empirical proof of the IDN concept, Kaiser notwithstanding. Others cast doubt on the four-stage model, pointing out that markets were not evolving through these four stages during the early to mid-1990s. 27 Even with its air of self-fulfilling prophecy, the model did not predict trends in vertical integration, except at a coarse national level. By the mid-1990s, several analyses of vertical integration should have served as flashing yellow lights on the road to integration. 28 The best one could take away from these studies was that cost-cutting would take time. The worst was that costs would actually increase. These studies were far from definitive. They were closer in spirit to case studies than they were to the kinds of systematic research that would emerge a decade later. When examined through an economic or management lens as by us in the next chapter, these mixed to negative findings were not surprising. Scale economies are always easier to discuss than to realize. Coordination and alignment of incentives are worthy goals, but integration assures neither. At the same time, large firms inevitably face problems of bureaucracy and motivating workers. In the 1980s these problems had plagued many corporate giants outside healthcare, which led in the 1990s to downsizing, unbundling, and virtual organizations. Those waving the flag for integration failed to ask a fundamental question: why should healthcare be exempt from economic and organizational fundamentals that caused businesses elsewhere in the economy to trend in the other direction? Nor did anyone ask if consumers wanted integrated care, let alone understand what it meant to them. Instead, the race to integrate was on. True believers drowned out the voices of skeptics. Integration had joined God, mother, and country as something whose virtue you could not question. A tidal wave. Hospital executives wasted no time putting words into actions. Within just a few years, the entire healthcare industry radically transformed, with independent providers coalescing into IDNs. IDNs usually revolved around a flagship tertiary care hospital, often an academic medical center like New York Presbyterian or Northwestern Memorial. These hospitals took referrals of the most difficult and often most profitable cases. The hospital's CEO often became the system's CEO, and all key management decisions and financial resources flowed from the flagship hospital. IDNs also included most, if not all, of the following components. Horizontal mergers with other hospitals, especially community feeder institutions. Primary care and specialty physician practices. Freestanding outpatient and/or diagnostic facilities. Therapy and/or home health care services. Long-term care facilities. In addition, many IDNs offered their own insurance product, or contracted with insurers to cover lives on a full-risk basis. Such an array of components supposedly enabled the IDNs to offer a seamless continuum of care and hopefully capture the premium dollar across it. Seamless is the opposite of fragmented, and carried only the best possible connotations. A chart developed by the advisory board depicting this continuum may have been the most popular slide on the speaker circuit during the 1990s. There are many different sources of data on the size and speed of the IDN tidal wave. All of them agree that it was big and happened quickly. For example, Deloitte and ch2 estimated that the percentage of U.S. hospitals belonging to IDNs increased from 16% in 1994 to 50% in 1998.29. While the tentacles of IDNs reached into nearly every corner of healthcare delivery, several features stood out: horizontal integration into hospital systems, vertical integration with physicians, and forays into health plans and risk contracting. Various organizations collected data on each of these strategies, which we discuss in turn. Horizontal integration into hospital systems. The assemblage of previously independent hospitals into hospital systems, as well as the merger of smaller hospital systems into larger hospital systems, formed the bedrock of IDNs. Consolidation occurred quite quickly during the 1994-98 period, ignited by the Clinton Health Plan of 1993. For the entire period from 1980 to 1993, there were fewer than 300 hospitals involved in horizontal mergers. In 1994 alone the number jumped to over 600, and remained above 500 each year until 1998, when the merger wave finally crested point 30. The numbers show all the symptoms of a contagion, in which one member of the population gets infected and rapidly spreads the infection to others. In this case, the hospital's resistance was worn down by the futurists, consultants, and academics promoting integrated healthcare. Figure 2.1. Continuum of care efforts, the integrated delivery network. Adapted from the Advisory Board Company. Vertical integration with physicians. Historically, physicians and hospitals had a unique partnership. They utterly relied on each other, yet operated as independent business entities. The closest thing to a formal relationship came through admitting privileges, which entitled physicians to bring their patients to the hospital and command the hospital's resources. Hospital executives had little say over how doctors practiced or how they were compensated. Doctors had little input into hospital service offerings, staffing, or pricing. Advocates of integration cited this separation of powers as a key source of inefficiency, which made it difficult for hospitals to cope with rising financial pressures that were due, many believed, to the ways in which physicians used, or misused, their pens. Much of the cost containment effort of the 1980s focused on hospital payment reform. Because DRGs capped payments for an entire hospitalization, hospital executives had to analyze and then manage care patterns and the intensity of resource use, or face potentially ruinous losses. At the same time, HMO contracts replaced open-ended hospital reimbursements with negotiated rates determined, in many cases, on a per diem or even per case basis. This was impossible to manage without the active support of the medical staff. Executives approached physicians for the first time for their help in operating within a budget constraint. Getting physicians to pay attention to costs proved to be a very stressful moment for both parties. Physicians were not quite ready for such conversations, and that inevitably bred distrust in their hospital partners. IDNs attempted to reduce this fragmentation by creating new financial arrangements between hospitals and physicians. Academics classified IDN models into a wide array of categories, each with its own three-letter acronym, TLA, based largely on the nature of the hospital-physician partnership. 31 The Physician-Hospital Organization, PHO, was a joint venture in which physicians and hospitals partnered to accept capitated risk contracts. In an independent practice association, IPA, a loose network of physicians contracted with a hospital, again to accept risk contracts. The integrated salary model, ISM, drew the most attention. In the ISM, hospitals employed physicians, often hundreds, who gave up their autonomy in exchange for financial security. There were other TLAs, too many to mention them all. Many analysts believed that IDNs could not transform healthcare delivery without employing physicians, and hospitals rushed to buy up as many practices as possible. According to one study, by 1997 IDNs were employing 17,000 primary care physicians. 32 This proved to be a big mistake, as we will discuss in the next chapter. Hospitals developed these vertically integrated models with physicians at the same time that they developed horizontally integrated systems by merging with other hospitals. Like horizontal integration, vertical integration between hospitals and physicians dramatically ramped up in 1994, and leveled off, though only slightly, after 1999. 33. Health plans and risk contracting. IDNs also got into the health insurance business, either as owners of in-house plans or by contracting for capitated lives. Consultants lectured hospitals that the HMOs in California markets were facing stiff competition from indemnity insurers. So California hospitals thought twice about starting their own HMOs. Elsewhere, however, HMOs or IDNs could underprice indemnity plans and earn profits by adopting California-style payment and delivery models. The question was, who would manage the care and earn those profits? IDNs that combined all three Kaiser components, hospital, physician, and health plan, were known as integrated healthcare organizations. Today they are called provider-sponsored plans, about which we will have much more to say later on. Many hospitals entered the health plan business to try to disintermediate the new managed care payers. We will be our own payer. Some even thought that they could pay their own hospitals and physicians more than what the HMOs were paying them. Others entered to get direct experience with risk contracting and prepare themselves for the inevitable spread of capitation. Since Medicare represented roughly 40% of the hospital's business, and because Medicare had developed interest in moving its enrollees into private HMO plans, today known as Medicare Advantage, the Medicare market seemed to hold high potential for revenue upside. The timing of hospital entry into the health plan business coincided with other integration initiatives, a dramatic increase in 1994, followed by a slightly earlier slowdown after 1998. At the zenith in 1996 and 1997, about 1 hospital in 4 sponsored a private health insurance plan. Many of those plans had minimal impact, however, with enrollments mainly limited to the hospital's own employees or, worse yet, patients. In addition to developing in-house health plans, hospitals also integrated with their physicians to engage in risk contracting with external health plans. The spread of these IDN models was linked to the growing penetration of local markets by HMOs and other forms of managed care. Roughly 1/3 of IDNs studied in 1995 had at least one capitated contract with payers. These proved more popular than the IDN's in-house plans. For those with capitated contracts, the mean number of contracts was roughly 5, and the mean number of covered lives was 38,000. 34. New managerial strategies and structures. Prior to the 1980s, hospital executives were schooled in dealing with largely protective regulatory environments. The 1990s brought a new set of business challenges. To meet them, hospital executives embraced the language and practice of traditional business management. 35 This transformation in the executive's mindset is reflected in this 2001 statement from the American College of Healthcare Executives Career Resource Center. In the past, most students chose the traditional route of a master's degree in health administration or public health. Today, however, students are investigating other options, including graduate degrees in business with course concentration in health services management. 36. With an emphasis on traditional business management came traditional business approaches. Hospitals pursued scale economies through more centralized management, systems building, and group purchasing, positioning them to directly profit from the resulting savings. Providers developed complex corporate structures, such as holding companies, that oversaw a diversified array of businesses, some not even focused on healthcare. 37 Hospitals also engaged in product line management, often a disguise for cultivating profitable clinical services and jettisoning unprofitable ones. Hospital executives focused on cost management in their dealings with physicians, for example, through educational seminars and physician leadership training. Some went so far as to use economic credentialing, evaluating physicians' privileges partly on the basis of their contribution to hospital profits. This engendered physician complaints about diminished clinical autonomy and the corporate practice of medicine. Hospital forays into the ambulatory care market represented an extension of the outpatient department strategy discussed in Chapter 1. Hospitals developed freestanding ambulatory services such as imaging, emergency or urgent care, surgery, and rehabilitation in occupational medicine, as well as remote physician office complexes. In some cases, aggressive ambulatory development brought hospitals into direct competition with the community-based physicians on their medical staff. In such cases, hospitals began to develop joint ventures with medical staff members to manage these potential conflicts. IDNs in action. By the late 1990s, IDNs had thoroughly transformed the healthcare landscape, as local health providers had morphed into giant businesses. An IDN encompassed one or more anchor hospitals and several feeder hospitals, hundreds of physicians, and either an in-house health plan or risk contracts with external plans. 38 Some IDNs diversified across geographic boundaries, making them quite complex to operate and manage. We provide a few examples of giant IDNs below, but save our discussion of the biggest of them all, the ill-fated Allegheny Health Education and Research Foundation, AHRF, for the next chapter. Hospital-led IDNs. Most of the giant systems were created by hospitals, and often had labyrinthine structures reflective of a seemingly random history of prior deals. Allina Health System, one of the first and most prominent IDNs, exemplified this model. Allina was the result of the merger of HealthSpan Health Systems and Medica HMO in 1993, each the product of prior mergers. Allina included 17 hospitals, 6,000 network physicians, organized into 55 to 60 clinics with more than 400 employed physicians, 2 nursing homes, and HMO and PPO health plans that covered 1/4 of the Minnesota population. The story of how Allina emerged is typical for many IDNs of the time, especially those in Stage 3 and Stage 4 markets. First, 2 purchasing groups formed among Minnesota employers to exert pressure on providers to rein in spending. The State of Minnesota Employees Health Benefit Program formed a purchasing group in 1985 on behalf of 144,000 enrollees. In 1991, 14 large Twin Cities employers formed the Buyers Healthcare Action Group to purchase coverage on behalf of 250,000 members through an exclusive contract with one delivery system. Second, the state legislature enacted Minnesota Care in 1993, which further encouraged providers to develop integrated service networks to provide a continuum of services in a cost-efficient manner. Third, the Twin Cities market had undergone a rapid and massive expansion of managed care enrollment from 500,000 in 1984 to nearly 3 million by 1994. The market now featured a heavy presence of managed care, with over 70% of the population in PPOs, commercial HMOs, and Medicare and Medicaid HMOs. These developments were so rapid and massive that many observers felt that the Twin Cities was becoming a Stage 5 marketplace. The creation of Allina was also noteworthy for the assumptions underlying the merger, assumptions that motivated many other vertical integration efforts during the decade. Foremost among these was that healthcare reform was imminent. It had already happened at the state level in 1993, and everyone assumed it was going to happen in 1994 at the federal level. Thus, the merger anticipated future regulatory controls and positioned the delivery system to deal with them. Second, everyone believed that common ownership of the continuum of care, example physicians, hospitals, and health plans, was the only way to achieve a truly integrated system. Only by combining all components of healthcare financing and delivery under one corporate roof could a system achieve real improvements in community health, live up to the name, health maintenance, and achieve real economic integration, whereby all components could be rewarded for their contribution to efficient, high-quality healthcare. The merger provided sufficient scale to manage the risk of a population and reap operating efficiencies. Third, the merger provided unified governance and single signature authority to contract as one with purchasers, employers, government. Such purchasers were believed to prefer a single point of accountability. Sutter Health, based in Sacramento, is one of today's largest and most successful systems, consisting of 24 hospitals, several medical foundations, and close partnerships with giant medical groups including Brown & Toland and the Palo Alto Medical Foundation. Sutter consisted of only 2 hospitals in 1983, and neither one held a dominant market position. Eager to emulate the Kaiser model, by 1993 Sutter encompassed 13 hospitals and 5 medical foundations employing more than 400 physicians. 39 For a time during the 1980s, it also co-owned a health plan, and in the 1990s it reinvested in another plan. Sutter's goals were to develop the leading regional health system in Northern California, counter the threat posed by Kaiser, which was gaining market share, avert the threat of investor-owned hospital systems, and respond to the managed competition message of Paul Elwood Innoval on Inthoven, who was preaching integration from his nearby office at Stanford. Physician-led IDNs. Large physician groups also jumped on the IDN bandwagon. The Fargo Clinic in North Dakota, one of the largest multi-specialty clinics in the United States with 250 physicians, expanded rapidly during the 1980s with the addition of several primary care practices. The clinic provided more than 90% of the admissions to St. Luke's Hospital, located next door. A series of joint ventures between the two organizations during the 1980s, Outpatient Surgery Center, MRI Service, Home Health Agency, Cancer Center, culminated in their merger in 1993 as Meritcare, partly in response to anticipated healthcare reform. Nearby in central Wisconsin, the Marshfield Clinic, with 400 physicians, likewise accounted for more than 90% of admissions to St. Joseph's Hospital. Founded in 1916, the multi-specialty clinic grew organically and opened a center next to the hospital in 1975. The clinic also operated its own HMO in 1971, which supplied about one-third of clinic patients and one-quarter of its revenues, as well as imaging, outpatient surgery, and other ancillary services. During the next 15 years, the clinic expanded aggressively into primary as well as specialty care practices in the region. The clinic and the hospital worked together through a joint conference committee without actually merging. 400 miles south in Urbana, Illinois, the Carle Clinic and the Carle Foundation Hospital followed a similar blueprint. The Carle Clinic consisted of 240 physicians in a multi-specialty group formed initially in 1931 by 2 physicians trained at the Mayo Clinic, and complemented by 6 more Mayo physicians by 1935. A year later, the physicians formed the hospital. The Carle Clinic and hospital are both physician-led, physician-centric organizations that are economically interdependent. Like the other physician organizations profiled above, the clinic operates profitable ancillary services such as radiology and a laboratory. Carle also opened its own in-house HMO health plan in 1980 which capitated physicians in the clinic. Nearly all of the HMO's patient care costs generated by in-house providers. To the east in Danville, Pennsylvania, lies the Geisinger Health System, now a famous system with unusual origins. A benefactor donated $500,000 in 1915 to build a small 63-bed hospital. The hospital's first medical staff member, another physician trained at the Mayo Clinic, convinced the benefactor to reorient the facility to emulate Mayo's multi-specialty model. That clinic enjoyed stable, long-tenured physician leadership for the remainder of the century. In 1972 Geisinger started its own health plan, spurred on by President Nixon's HMO Act. During the 1980s, Geisinger began to aggressively market its health plan, but it needed more physicians to do so. In 1982 the Geisinger Clinic had 207 physicians. Over the next 10 years, it added another 300, including about 150 PCPs to complement the traditional specialist mix. The expansion consisted of joint development of a multi-specialty clinic and affiliated nearby hospital in other northern Pennsylvania cities, example Wilkes-Barre. Health plan enrollment rocketed from 12,000 lives in 1985 to 144,000 lives by 1993. Nearly all medical care of health plan enrollees was rendered by physicians in the Geisinger system. These and many other physician-led IDNs differed from the hospital-led models in some significant ways. First, their roots lay in large multi-specialty groups founded early in the 20th century. In this manner, they were physician-centric, collaborative provider organizations. Second, they developed health plans prior to the managed care era, oftentimes in the 1970s. They thus had more experience and comfort with risk contracting and assumption of risk. Third, they primarily operated in rural areas of the country, sheltered from the demands of more urban-based Blue Cross and commercial plans. This enabled them to develop dominant market shares that inhibited entry by other payers and providers. Private sector investments in physician practices. Physician-led IDNs represented one end of the spectrum of physician involvement in management. Most physicians wanted less involvement. They had become doctors to save lives, not to run businesses. Their challenge was to focus on patient care while dealing with burdensome administrative requirements and facing growing capital needs for new office management technologies, including electronic billing and fledgling electronic health records. While many physicians were thrilled when IDNs offered guaranteed incomes plus generous upfront buyouts, others wanted to retain some degree of autonomy. This created a market opportunity for independent firms to offer to manage physician practices while otherwise leaving the doctors to be doctors. This was the rationale behind physician practice management, PPM, companies. PPMs began in the late 1980s, as government regulations and the demands of HMOs and PPOs began taking their toll on physicians. PPMs offered physicians what seemed to be a win-win proposition. PPMs would handle all of the administrative aspects of practice management, including billing and collections and negotiations with insurers, while offering low-interest loans for capital equipment. Some PPMs secured capitated HMO contracts on behalf of a pool of physicians. In this way, PPMs resembled large group practices that accepted capitated risk for the group, although in this case the physicians often did not even know who else was in the pool. In exchange for handling the financial side of medical practice, PPMs kept roughly 15% of practice revenues. By the early 1990s, thousands of physicians had signed over their practices to PPMs eager for more rapid growth. Several PPMs including PHYCOR, FPA Medical Management, and relative newcomer MedPartners raised capital by going public. They soon became Wall Street stars. MedPartners shone the brightest. Richard Scrushy, a former respiratory therapist who had previously founded the rehabilitation services company Health South, co-founded MedPartners in 1992. A medical professional with a proven entrepreneurial track record, Scrushy was hailed as a business genius. He spoke at countless management school forums, describing his vision for bringing management rigor to medical practice. Scrushy and his PPM brethren convinced investors that the business model was easily scaled. With financial backing from Wall Street investors, PPMs eventually recruited more than 10,000 physicians. Share values skyrocketed, and MedPartners cracked the Fortune 500. Many analysts, including both authors of this book, were having a hard time figuring out how PPMs could be so profitable. They offered essentially the same deal as hospitals. They would buy physicians' practices, and put the physicians on fixed salaries, but hospitals offered 2 advantages over PPMs. First, physicians who were nervous about selling out to investor-owned corporations felt no such compunction about selling out to hospitals. Second, and probably more important, hospitals could afford to pay more than PPMs, because they expected the acquired physicians to bring their patients with them. Within a few years, PPMs were going bankrupt. So were some IDNs. The term, integrated delivery, once on everyone's lips, swiftly fell out of favor, with mentions in modern healthcare plummeting from 83 in 1998 to 21 in 2000. In the next chapter we describe how and why things went so terribly wrong with integrated healthcare. No text can be read aloud. 4.